this story we have in our heads that addiction is caused primarily by the chemical hooks in the drug. And I think the answer is complicated. What you begin to realise is all addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. Important though that is to many people, the opposite of addiction is connection, right?
Hi guys, and welcome back to another episode of Life Uncut. I'm Laura.
I'm Brittany, and today we have an interview that I'm very excited for, mainly because he's been on the podcast twice. This will be his third time. You will be the second person in Life Uncut history to have made 3 appearances on Life Uncut, Johann.
Oh my God, who was the other one?
Terry Cole.
Terry Cole. Do you know Terry?
No, I have no idea. That was that facial expression, so I thought it'd be rude not to, but I have no idea who Terry Cole is.
She's incredible, an incredible psychotherapist. That is the Terry
Oh,
Cole.
interesting. Yeah. Right, okay.
Yeah.
Now, because of that, I would like to think you are a man that doesn't need an introduction, but there are probably some new people here who don't know who you are. Sorry. Johann Hari is a best-selling author of many books like Lost Connections, which is about anxiety, depression, Stolen Focus on why we can't pay attention, and one earlier that Laura and Keisha spoke to you this year, The Magic Pill, which is all about Ozempic, the pros and cons, your experience in itself. We're going to talk today about your other book, Chasing the Scream, the first and last days on the war on drugs. We previously released an episode just recently with Kate DeAraugo about her experiences with addiction. But today we wanted to look at addiction a bit more broadly, speak about how it comes, why so many of our loved ones are battling with addiction, and maybe squash some of the misconceptions that I think we all have about addiction. Before we get into that though, Johann, you have had 2 of the most brilliant, accidentally unfiltered, embarrassing stories on this podcast in podcast history.
Just to remind you all what they were. One story was around how the Dalai Lama called Johann fat.
He's a fucking bitch.
Yeah.
Horrible.
No one would ever say that of what do people call him? He's like
He's like the spiritual leader of Tibet.
Yes,
guru.
no, but he's like, there's like a...
What are you talking about?
Like the almighty being. He's like the, whatever
yeah.
he is. Anyway, he was supposed to be above it, but he wasn't.
Yeah, and then you fat shamed him back. That was the best part.
I did.
Yeah.
I did say, well, you're quite fat as well.
You really
it was
showed
not
him,
my
didn't
finest
you?
moment in journalism, but like...
Did you hand him some Ozempic?
I should send him a little pen now, huh? Hey, getting on, eh?
The other one was how you got a Christmas card from your chicken shop, which really, once again, drives home the Ozempic story, doesn't it?
It was underscores that maybe the Dalai Lama had a point, to be fair. But yes, very sad.
Do you have an accidentally unfiltered that can top that?
I do. So, in 2018, I spent 3 months completely off the internet for my book, Stolen Focus. And so I didn't have my phone. I was in this place in Cape Cod called Provincetown, and my phone was with my friend in Boston. And when I got my phone back, I turned it on, and there were loads of voice messages, right? And there were a few that were like unknown number, so I almost didn't bother checking them. And after about a week, I checked them. And one of them, it was a message that said, I've still got it stored on my phone. Hi, Johann, this is Oprah. Immediately, it was like, this is someone taking the piss out of me because they know that I'm like obsessed with Oprah, right? Literally obsessed. Like from when I was like 6, me and my grandmother every day would watch the Oprah Winfrey Show, and it like completely shaped my worldview. And she said, I read your book, Lost Connections, and I really loved it. And I wanted to just say, maybe you'd like to come and visit me at my house. And it just goes on and on for like a few minutes. She's talking about how much she loved my book, right? And then she goes, but you don't have an answer machine. I can't do an American accent, bro. You don't have an answer machine message, so I'm not going to leave my number, but I'll call you back, right? And this was like, she'd left this message 2 months before. And I was like, simultaneously like buzzing, thinking, is it someone taking the piss out of me?
I've ghosted Oprah.
Exactly. But also I was like, well, how do I now get in touch with her? Right? Like, because I just...
You ruined your chance.
So I literally waited 1.5 months, and I was in London, I was about to go in to see a play, and I see an unknown number. And again, I almost didn't answer it. And I answered it, and she's like, hi, Johann, it's Oprah. And I'm sort of mouthing to my friend, we're about to go in, I'm like, I'm going to miss this fucking play, I don't care, right? I was like, it's Oprah. It's Oprah, right? He knows that I hate opera, and he'd bought the tickets, and he's like, no, it's a play. It's not opera. I'm like, no, Oprah. So I just walk off, right? And he went in on his own. And anyway, she's like, do you want to come to my house? I was like, I had no idea where her house was. I just said, yes, right?
I'll be
Immediately.
there.
So like a few months later, I went to her house. I was in LA, and her house, one of her houses is in Montecito, which is about 2 hours out of LA. So they send a car, and the guy drives me. And we get to like this gate, and the driver says like a little security code, which I tried to memorize, but I couldn't. And we go through the gate, and there's this like stunning house, right? And he says, you just go up there. So I went up to the house, and I'm standing there, but there's no doorbell or anything. So I'm just sort of standing there, and no one comes, and I'm just like, this is weird. So I go back to the driver, and I said, oh, there's no doorbell. What do I do? And he said, oh, just let yourself in. And I said, I'm sure I'm not meant to just let myself into Oprah's house. I'll get shot, right? This is a really, it's like, oh, no, you're meant to just let yourself in. So I go up to the house. I sort of very tentatively, I like open the door and I can see there's a sort of little seating area. So I sit down and directly opposite the seating area, there's a photo of Oprah with Barack and Michelle Obama the night of the presidential election when he won, a photo of Oprah with Maya Angelou, and a photo of Oprah with Nelson Mandela, right? So I am shitting myself as I wait. And I'm literally there for like 40 minutes. And then someone just appears and goes, oh, hi, Johann, I'm here to take you to Oprah. And I was like, oh, great, right? So we're walking through this house. And I said, isn't Oprah's house like incredible? It's stunning. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, oh, it's so beautiful. She said, this isn't Oprah's house. And I said, where are we? She said, this is the guard's hut for Oprah's house. We go out and in the distance, there's a fucking palace that makes Buckingham Palace look like a homeless person's shoe. She's like, that's Oprah's house. And I was like, oh, okay. So
There's nothing more humbling, is there?
I thought the guard's hut was like the palatial, like heaven. And it was like, oh no. And it's bizarre because in her house, I've now been several times, everything just, it really is like a vision of the afterlife, right? When you think that if you've died, everything just, everything,
like
I said to her last
gold,
time, what does everything smell of? Everything smells like perfect in your house. It's just like, yeah, it's like literally like heaven.
But like, how? Also, I have so many questions, and that's not what this episode is about. We have loved speaking to you over the last couple of years, and it's interesting because so much, there's been multiple books, but so much of it comes back to a similar and core messaging, and there's this current thread that kind of weaves through it all. And even when we spoke about people's use of mobile phones, we talked about addiction. When we talked about Ozempic and we talked about how people can use it, we talked about the impacts that it can have on diet culture and potential addiction. We have spoken last week, as Britt said, to Kate DeAraugo. Now, to give you the backstory on that so that you're familiar, she won Idol within Australia and she had everything set up for her to be successful, but she fell down the absolute rabbit warren of becoming an ice addict and how that affected her life, her ability to, she had no ability to do a job, and she did that on a very public scale. What is it about addiction that you became fascinated with? Because unless it's something that you've experienced yourself and you feel as though addiction is something that's permeated your life, like what was it about that made you want to research this?
It's interesting thinking about that, your previous guest, in relation to, obviously, we're talking just after the death of Louis from One Direction as well, and about that intersection with fame. But for me, addiction was something that was there really all my life. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was too young then to understand why, but as I got older, I realised we had drug addiction in my family. Several members of my family we still do. When I started researching the subject a long time ago now, 13 years ago, I think like everyone in that position, everyone who's got someone they love who's got an addiction problem, I was a real mixture of feelings because part of me looked at the people I loved and could see that they were really suffering and felt really compassionate and wanted to help them. But also, nothing I was doing seemed to help. I think also, if I'm honest, there was a bit of me that was really angry, right? That was like, well, why can't you just stop, right?
Yeah.
I was never a supporter of the drug war or kind of criminal punishment, but I had those voices in my head, right? Because I'd seen this so much and because it was so close to me and because I really wanted to help the people that I loved and just for myself, really, more importantly, I ended up going on this really big journey all over the world. I traveled over 30,000 miles. I wanted to meet people with really different perspectives on drugs, addiction, the war on drugs. And I got to know like a crazy mixture of people who really changed my life and changed how I think, from a trans crack dealer in Brooklyn called Chino Hardin, who is one of the wisest people I know, to a hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel called Rosalio Reta. He's not one of the smartest people I know.
Shock.
The only country that's decriminalized all drugs with incredible results that I'm sure we'll talk about. And what I learned is like, it's such a weird thing to say because I had seen this all my life and I realized I had profoundly misunderstood what I had been watching since I was a kid, right? Drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is. The war on drugs is not what we think it is. The alternatives to the way we treat people with addiction problems are not what we think they are. It really screws with your head at first when you realize how much we've got wrong about this. But the reason why I think it's worth going on that journey into learning about what we've got wrong is because then you start to see the places that have understood what's really going on and start to put in place approaches that actually do work in helping people survive, helping people recover. And the evidence on that is really clear. So the whole thing was a really profound journey for me.
You are so generous with your knowledge and your time and your research. You don't just sit at home on the computer and do your Googling. You don't jump on Zoom. What was it about your childhood and growing up that made you think, okay, not only am I going to dedicate my life to this research, but I want to go and experience it myself. I want to meet these people in the flesh. I don't want to sit back and take the easy route.
I think it was a combination of things. It was love for them, but also I wanted to make sense of it for myself. Never forgotten Chino, one of the people I just mentioned. Chino had a mother with a very bad addiction problem. He grew up in Brownsville in Brooklyn. He said this very painful line to me once. He said the reason he started, in his case, he started smoking crack. He said, I wanted to know what my mother chose over me. And I think if you've had those addiction experiences as a child, you want to make sense of it for yourself as well as for them. And then there was also, I could see one of the younger members of my family was having issues in this area. And I think that was also really decisive for me. It was like, okay, I've got to make sense of this. And there were so many things that I learned, but probably the most challenging and ultimately the most freeing was to realize I had actually misunderstood what addiction is. So if you had asked me 13 years ago before I started doing this research, Johann, what causes heroin addiction? Let's choose that because it was close to me, right? I think I would have looked at you like you're an idiot and I would have said, well, the clue's in the name. Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction. We've been told this story for 100 years that's become totally part of our common sense, right? It was certainly part of mine. So we think, we're sitting here in North Sydney. If we kidnap the next 20 people to walk past this studio and like a villain in a Saw movie, we injected them all with heroin 3 times a day for a month. At the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave if they had that long an exposure. That's one reason why in English, another word for being addicted is being hooked, right? First thing that alerted me to the fact there's something wrong with that story. Now, chemical hooks are definitely real, but it turns out they're a very small part of what's going on with addiction. It's when it was explained to me by Dr. Gabor Mate, who I think you probably know his work, a friend of mine, brilliant Canadian doctor. Gabor said to me, in Britain, where I'm from, if you step out into the street and you get hit by a car and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine, right? Diamorphine is heroin. It's medically pure heroin. It's much better than the shit you could score in King's Cross, right? It's the good stuff, right? If you're in a British hospital with broken hip, for example, you'll often be given that heroin for quite a long period of time. If anyone listening, if you've got a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your nan's taken a lot of heroin, right? If what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the chemical hooks, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals being given heroin for quite long periods of time? They should be leaving and trying to score on the streets.
All our grannies should be heroin addicts.
Yeah, or at least some of them, right?
But isn't it the case for the fact that if it's been administered in hospital that it's a considered dosage, within a reasonable amount? Like, aren't there then limitations on how that drug is administered that might affect someone becoming quote unquote hooked on it?
There's some limitations, but actually often people in hospitals are using it more than people out on the streets, right? So I remember when I learned that and looking at that evidence, just thinking, well, that can't be true, right? How could it be that you've got someone in a hospital bed being given quite a lot of medically pure heroin, they don't become addicted, you've got someone shooting up in the alleyway outside, actually often shooting up less and a weaker form of the drug, and they do become addicted. I just thought that can't be right. And I only began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an incredible man named Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that's really transformed how we understand addiction all over the world. So Professor Alexander explained to me, this story we have in our heads that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by the chemical hooks in the drug comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your listeners can try them at home if they feel a little bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. And what happens when you do that is the rat tries both bottles, it doesn't know what's in it, and it prefers the drug water almost always, and it almost always kills itself within a couple of weeks, right? So there you go, that's our story, right? The rat tries the drugs, once it's tried them, it wants more and more of them, and then it kills itself. But in the 70s, Bruce came along and said, well, hang on a minute, you put the rat alone in an empty cage, it's got nothing that makes life meaningful for rats. It's got nothing that meets the rat's needs psychologically. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a rat cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats, right? They got loads of friends, they got loads of cheese, they got loads of coloured balls. Everything a rat likes in life is there. They can have loads of sex. It's got everything that meets a rat's needs, right? And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drug water. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drug water. They don't use it very much. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. So you go from heavy compulsive use and overdose when they don't have the things that make life worth living to no compulsive use and overdose when they do have the things that make life worth living. Now, there's lots of human examples of this, and I'm sure we're going to talk about lots of evidence. This also applies to humans. But I never forget the day I first met Bruce. It was on a place called the Downtown East Side, which is an area a bit like the old King's Cross here in Sydney, kind of area with notoriously a lot of drug use, kind of street scene. And I went to a little place called Pigeon Park. There were a lot of people shooting up around me and stuff. And sitting there and thinking, so what he means is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. Important though that is to many people, the opposite of addiction is connection, right? Everyone knows they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in trouble really quickly. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs, right? You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel that you've got safety. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And our culture is good at lots of things, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. And so what we need is a connection to getting those deeper needs met.
When you discovered this, and I asked this question when you know that this is something that has permeated your family. Is that not a really hard realization? Because it's almost easier to be like, drug addiction is selfish. Drug addiction is, it's a choice that's being made that I don't have control over, that someone else is doing, and it's a selfish choice. But when you know that it comes down to, and in the research that you've done, this idea that it's a lack of connection, it's a lack of belonging, that there's many other things that are attributing to this. When you go, but I'm in this family and we're in this family and we're all here trying to be supportive of you. We're all here trying to connect with you, but yet you're still making these decisions that are inherently selfish. Where is the line with this? And I do ask this question, and I'm very conscious about inserting myself into this conversation as well. My stepdad was a heroin addict. It's something that was all throughout my childhood. And some parts of me almost feels like a bit of resentment when I hear it, because I'm like, I know that it's the truth, but also I'm like, you had everything, but yet you still chose the drug. And it's hard to reconcile that, I guess, without ruling it out as being just a selfish choice that was made.
I think there's so much wisdom in your question. And I think the answer is complicated. I had to think through that thing that you've just said as well, where you go, there's all sorts of layers in what you just said that are really interesting. So one is, but this person's still making a selfish choice in the way, which is definitely how I had thought about it, or part of me had thought about it. And then actually you look at it and go, when you understand the insights that flow from Rat Park and lots of other evidence around addiction, what you begin to realise is all addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. It's a really challenging thing. You know Marianne Faithfull, the great singer? She's most famous for having gone out with Mick Jagger, which really pisses me off because she's much better than Mick Jagger, and Mick Jagger is pretty fucking great. So Marianne had a heroin addiction when she was in the 60s, when she was much younger, and she nearly died with it. She was homeless and she was in a terrible state. And in her memoir, she writes this line that I found really challenging. She said, heroin saved my life because if it wasn't for heroin, I would have killed myself at that point. Marianne is obviously not saying that heroin is a good solution to despair, right? For all the obvious reasons that no one needs me to explain, right? But it's the best solution anyone offered her at that point in her life. And when you look at it and you go, it's not this selfish person doing this self-destructive thing. You're actually trying to save yourself. Right? You're actually trying, like she says, you're trying to solve a problem. If the problem is you're in unbearable pain and you can't get through the day, and there's this thing that for a moment will take, or more than a moment, will take away your pain, it reframes how you look at the person. Also, that's very important for so much of how we're taught to respond to people with addiction problems in this culture, and indeed how the government responds to people with addiction problems mostly, is we think, oh, you're indulging yourself, so we need to punish you and inflict pain on you to give you an incentive to stop. But once you understand this different way of thinking about it, actually pain is the cause of addiction, right? Addiction is an attempt to solve that problem of pain. Suddenly you realise, oh, this thing that we're saying is a solution is actually making the problem worse, right?
A question that I ask is not because, and I don't want anyone to misconstrue it in terms of like, that this is how I now feel. But I also understand that there are kids who have had parents who are addicts who feel as though, why wasn't I enough? If it comes down to connection, why is that, as the child wasn't I enough? Or people who are partners who have, husbands or wives who are addicts, like why is what we have not enough? And I think for myself, it's been a great learning that it's like, it's not about me. It's not about what I could provide to that relationship.
Do you want to say, you are totally allowed to feel that, right? Because I know that we're all live in this world where we're double guessing how people on social media will misconstrue what we're saying and attack us. So I get why you're cautious about saying it. But you are totally allowed to feel what you just said. And the way I think about it is, again, because the way we think about these problems, some people hear what I'm saying and they think, totally understandably, the only form of connection that they can then picture is interpersonal, individual connection, right? So like you said, well, why wasn't I good enough? I loved my relative who was addicted. I had a very strong connection with them, and yet they chose X drug over me, or gambling, or whatever it might be, right? Porn, whatever they might be addicted to. And I think we need to understand addiction. This is partly what my book Lost Connections is about. We need to understand connection in a much deeper way than just interpersonal connection. Interpersonal connection is really, really important. It's unbelievably valuable and necessary for human beings. But there's loads of forms of connection. I go through 9 in Lost Connections. Connection to meaningful work, which has been completely stripped away. If you look at the places in Australia that have the highest addiction rates, they're places where they've got real economic problems often, right? There's connection to meaningful values. You've got to have a sense of values, spiritual values. I don't mean that in a religious sense necessarily, but spiritual values that
something
guide
greater than yourself.
Exactly. You've got to have connection to a sense of security. You've got to have. There's all sorts of factors that go through in the book, right? I think one of the cruelest things we do with addiction, with depression, with so many of these things, is we put the job of solving it solely onto the addicted person and their family. We don't. Let's think about car accidents. We don't do that with car accidents. We don't say, if you're mangled in a horrible car wreck and get horribly, get seriously injured, we don't then say it's your job to enforce the speed limits and reduce car accidents, right? The whole society works to reduce car accidents. We have seatbelts, we have speed limits, we have all sorts of things where everyone reduces that problem together, right? Yeah. I would argue we need to do the same with addiction, and I went to places that have done it, like Portugal, I suspect we'll talk about. So there's all sorts of levels to that. So absolutely interpersonal connection is important. And I do think once you learn these things, it begins to flip a lot of the things that we're told on our heads. Like, so we're told, for example, if someone you love is addicted, cut them off because that'll make them hit rock bottom and then they'll, somehow get better, right? Actually, I think the evidence is pretty clear. While people certainly should impose boundaries to protect themselves, there's no point sacrificing, if you're going to destroy yourself to help someone, that's actually helps neither of you. Of course, I believe in sensible boundaries for people, but the idea that automatically cutting someone off or threatening them makes them better is not true, right? And for a lot of people, rock bottom will be death.
It's also then how do you live with that decision? If you've been told cut someone off because it'll help them reach rock bottom, they're only going to make these changes once they realize that they don't have people to depend on. And it's if the alternate is that the worst case happens and that person dies, how do you then live with yourself? Yeah. The person that's left over who cut them off because you were trying to enforce clear boundaries. It's so challenging, and it affects an entire family, not just the person who is addicted.
Totally.
Something that you did just brush over is you were saying that there's these 9 points of connection, but I find it fascinating in your research that you say there's only 2 of those 9 that are biological.
Yeah. There's 3 kinds of cause. When it comes to depression, anxiety, addiction, attention problems, obesity, a whole range of things that I write about in my different books, there's 3 kinds of cause of these problems. There's biological causes, like your genes and real brain changes that happen as you become addicted or obese that make it harder to go back, although they don't write your destiny. There's psychological causes like trauma, for example, would be an obvious one. And then there are social causes, like if you're very financially insecure would be one, but there's loads, right? And the kind of fancy term for this is the biopsychosocial model. All these things have biopsychosocial causes, biological causes, psychological causes, social causes. And to some degree, all of those factors play out for everyone who's got one of those problems, right? The way I began to think about it is almost like think about it as a bathtub with 3 taps. So some people will have a very strong biological tap and a strong psychological tap and a low social tap. Some people have a very low biological tap, high, but it all swirls into the same bathtub that makes up you, right? You are the product of all of these factors. But what we've done as a culture very often with these problems is we just tell a biological story. Professor Lawrence Kim, who's at McGill University, said to me, in theory, we have a biopsychosocial model, right? It's in all the textbooks. But in practice, we have a bio model. Basically, all we talk to people about is the biology with most of these problems, right? So we're missing loads of the picture. And I'm conscious that as we're talking about this, a lot about the problem, but actually one of the things that's so empowering to me is I went to places that then built on these insights to get to solutions that really do work. But when we're talking about chemical hooks before, I spend a lot of time in Las Vegas because I'm writing a book about a series of crimes that have been happening there. One of the people that I'm writing about, someone I really loved who was murdered, it's a terrible story. His name was Tommy Martin. He had a gambling addiction. We also had gambling addiction in my family. So think about gambling addiction is a really interesting way of thinking about this, right? Because we're trained to think, oh, it's caused just by the drug, right? But anyone listening, if you go to a meeting of Gamblers Anonymous tonight, wherever you are, those people are just as addicted as the people in the Narcotics Anonymous room up the corridor, right? And yet we all know you don't snort a roulette wheel, you don't inject a pack of cards. There's no chemical hook involved in gambling. If you can have all of the addiction but no chemical hook, that tells you something. That doesn't mean chemical hooks don't also contribute to it. We actually know this about chemical hooks. We know how much they contribute. There's an experiment that actually loads of people listening will have taken part in related to cigarettes. So I think we might have talked about this before, but my mother smokes 70 cigarettes a day. There's an amazing photo of me and her when I'm a baby where she's breastfeeding me, smoking and resting the ashtray on my stomach. And when I discovered this, I thought she'd feel guilty. I showed it to her. She said, "You were a fucking difficult baby. I needed that cigarette." She was totally unrepentant.
But I also don't think you're alone in the fact of being of that generation where your parents smoked while
It was totally normal, right?
So
wild,
normal.
right? I wanted to put the photo in one of my books. She said, "You're not putting my tits in your fucking book." But
She's from Glasgow, isn't she?
She's militantly Scottish. No, I'm not just doing a weird voice. So you think about cigarettes, right? So we know when you smoke, if you smoke cigarettes, you smoke tobacco cigarettes, after a while, you will start to crave the chemical hook in tobacco, which is nicotine, right? There's loads of evidence on this. No one disputes it. In the late 80s, early 90s, scientists figured out a way that you could give people who are addicted to cigarettes all of the nicotine that they're addicted to, but without them having to smoke. Nicotine patches, right? So at the time, they thought, oh, if you're addicted to cigarettes, that is an addiction to the chemical hook nicotine. So when we give you the patch, you're just going to stop, right? And then it was rolled out. And as we know, the US Surgeon General did a big report on it. 17% of smokers, 17%, if you give them nicotine patches, stop smoking. Now, that is not nothing. That's a lot of people, right? That's a big deal. That's saved, a conservative estimate, hundreds of thousands of people's lives. But that leaves 83% of the addiction that has to be explained in some other way, which is more about stress, anxiety, lost connections, all these things that we're talking about.
But also the addiction to the habit.
Yeah, habitual, the movement, the motion, the socializing. That's
exactly.
It's why they also, a lot of people refer to doing drugs as having a habit.
Totally. 100%.
You've spoken about it a little bit and we've brought it up a couple of times saying we'll get there, but I think we're there now. Portugal has decriminalised drug use and, I mean, overarchingly, they've decriminalised what we in Australia still see as illegal drugs. I think that there's been many conversations had as to whether that's going to be impactful, beneficial, or whether it's going to just turn into like everyone rampant doing heroin on the streets. And that was kind of the debate that was happening here in Australia. What was the impact in Portugal when they decriminalised drug use?
It's interesting, when I was researching this, I put off going for a while because I think I was afraid about what if it didn't work, right? But the evidence on the ground in Portugal and the scientific evidence is really unambiguous. So in the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is staggering. And every year they tried the American way, the way that we follow, not quite as bad as the Americans, but punishment, our primary response is arrest people, punish them, shame them, give them criminal records.
Prison.
Also monetary fines, which it's like usually when people have severe addiction issues, money is something that is also a problem. So it's like having a fine for an addiction issue doesn't really help the cause.
Exactly. In fact, it makes it worse, I would
Absolutely.
argue. I think you're totally right. But that was the way they did it in Portugal, because that was the way pretty much everywhere in the world did it. Until finally one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they said, look, we can't go on like this with ever more people becoming addicted to heroin. What can we do? So they decided to set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man I got to know named Dr. João Goulão. And they said to this panel, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem. And we've agreed in advance, we'll do whatever you recommend. So the goal was to just take it out of politics. It'd be like if Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese just agreed, we'll do whatever a panel recommends, right? So the panel went away for a couple of years. They looked at all the evidence, including Rat Park, loads of stuff like that. And they came back and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack, everything. But, and this is the crucial next step, we're going to take all the money we currently spend on screwing people up, shaming them, imprisoning them, punishing them, and spend all that money instead on turning their lives around. And interestingly, it was not what we think of as drug treatment in Britain and Australia. So they do some residential rehab, that has value. But the biggest thing they did was a huge program of housing support and job creation.
Wow.
They'll go to, say you used to be a mechanic and you've got an addiction problem. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to say to every person with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back.
We're here to help.
Exactly. And you deserve help. And by the time I went to Portugal, it was 13 years into that. And the results were completely unambiguous. So at the time, there were 27 members of the European Union. There's 26 now because my country went crazy, but put that to one side. 27 members of the European Union. Portugal went from having the worst problems in the European Union to almost having the lowest. Addiction was massively down. HIV transmission was massively down. Overdose deaths were massively down. People will look at these figures. They're in the book, but also the British Journal of Criminology did a really good detailed study of all of this. And one of the ways you know it works so well is that almost no one in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed a guy called João Figueira, who was the top drug cop in Portugal at the time of the decriminalisation. And he said at the time, what lots of people totally understandably say when they hear this idea, he said, decriminalising all drugs, this is madness.
Yeah.
We'll have an explosion in children using drugs. We'll have an explosion in drug tourism. We can't do this. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he said he felt really ashamed that he'd spent so many years arresting and shaming and punishing people when he could have been helping them turn their lives around. And this is something I saw all over the world that had moved beyond the drug war, from Vancouver to Uruguay to Switzerland to Portugal. Policies based on shame and punishment make the problem worse. Policies based on love and compassion, over time, reduce these problems.
Well, we've said the word a few times, but I would love to kind of focus in on a little bit. Shame as a byproduct of drug addiction and drug use, especially in this country. How is the shame and the stigma that's surrounding it making it so much worse?
There's so many ways, but there's a story that I learned really helped me to think about this and helped me to think about the shame I was directing towards the people I love.
Yeah.
I opened the book with Chasing the Scream with this story, and I think at first some people are like, why is he beginning a book about the war on drugs, like an addiction, with this story? But bear with me and you begin to see. So in 1939, in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, the great jazz singer Billie Holiday walked onto a stage and she sang a song called Strange Fruit, which is a song, most people will know it, but it's a song about lynching. It's the idea that in the South there's this strange fruit that hangs from the trees and it's the bodies of black men who've been murdered by white mobs. And her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me, you've got to understand how explosive this was. This was not a time when people had political songs, right? So to stand in front of a mixed audience and sing this song is explosive. Years later, Malcolm X called it the musical starting gun for the civil rights movement. And that night, Billie got a warning from the agents of a man named Harry Anslinger. And they basically said, stop singing this song. So Harry Anslinger is a really important person. He was a big government bureaucrat who took over the Department of Alcohol Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition was ending in the US. So the US had a war on alcohol and alcohol won, right? And he wanted to keep it going, keep his department going. And at that time, most drugs were legal. So he invented the modern war on drugs. He's the first person to ever use the phrase war on drugs. And he builds the war on drugs around criminalizing certain drugs and around two groups he really hated. The first group was people with addiction problems. He'd had a bad experience when he was a kid. He really hated addicts. And the second group he hated was black people.
Wow.
And he was so crazily racist. He was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1920s, which was not easy to do, right?
Yeah.
He used the N-word so often in official memos. At the time, his own senator said he should have to resign. And to Harry Anslinger, Billie Holiday was the symbol of everything he hated, right? She's a black woman standing up to racism, and she had an addiction problem. We know why Billie had an addiction problem. She grew up in a very poor part of Baltimore that was known as Pigtown. And one day when she was 11, a 42-year-old man named Wilbur Rich came to her and said, oh, your mother's sent me to get you. You've got to come with me. I'm going to take you to your mother. And he took her and he raped her. And Wilbur Rich was punished. He was sent to prison for 1.5 years. Billie Holiday was punished much worse. She was sent to a convent. The nuns told her, these are obviously words I would not use, it's the words they used, that she was a whore, that she'd made the man do it, she'd led him on. It was her fault. And even as a child, Billie Holiday was like, no, I didn't. And they punished her in escalating ways, including locking her in overnight with dead bodies because they had a funeral parlour next to this convent. And Billie Holiday ran away to find her mother. And her mother was working in a brothel in Harlem. So Billie went to find her mother. And she started kind of working in inverted commas alongside her mother. I'm putting working in inverted commas because she was a child. So she's being raped for money by strangers day after day after day after day. At one point, the police raid the brothel. Instead of rescuing Billie, she's 15 years old, they send her to prison. And in this situation, Billie develops a quite severe addiction to alcohol and later to heroin. But Billie Holiday also becomes one of the great geniuses of the 20th century. She reinvents singing. People as different as Frank Sinatra and Jay-Z, so that she transformed how they sang. She becomes a staggering genius. When Harry Anslinger's agents tell her to stop singing this song, she says, in effect, fuck you, I'm an American citizen, I'll sing what I damn well please. And at that point, Anslinger resolves to destroy her. And he employs a guy called Jimmy Fletcher. So Anslinger hated employing black agents, but you couldn't really employ a white guy to follow Billie Holiday everywhere around Harlem. It'd be kind of obvious. So he employed Jimmy Fletcher, and he said to him, follow Billie everywhere she goes, document her drug use, document the drug use of all the jazz singers.
Yeah.
We're going to bust them all. So Jimmy follows Billie Holiday around for a year and a half. He dances with her, he gets to know her really well. And when you read the surviving interview with Jimmy, it's pretty clear that she was so amazing, he fell in love with her. And his whole life, he felt really ashamed of what he'd done. He arrested her. She was put on trial. The trial was called The United States versus Billie Holiday, which is the name of the film that got made out of my book. She said, the trial was called The United States versus Billie Holiday, and that's how it fucking felt. She was sent to prison. She didn't sing a word in prison. But the cruelest thing is what happened next. So when she got out of prison, you needed at that time, anywhere where alcohol was served, something called a cabaret performer's license. And Anslinger makes sure she doesn't get it. Another one of her godchildren said to me, what is the cruelest thing you can do to a person? Is to take away the thing they love.
Take away their soul.
Exactly. And in that situation, entirely predictably, Billie relapses. One day she collapsed in New York, not very far from where she'd sung Strange Fruit that night. The first hospital she was taken to refused to take her because she had an addiction problem. Second hospital agreed to take her, but Billie was convinced that Anslinger's men weren't finished with her. She said to her friend Maylie, they're going to kill me in there, don't let them. She wasn't wrong. So in the hospital, she was diagnosed with quite advanced liver cancer. Anslinger's men come and they arrested her on her hospital bed. They handcuffed her to a hospital bed. I interviewed the last surviving person who'd been in that room, an amazing man named the Reverend Eugene Callender, who walked out of the hospital and led protests outside saying that they were killing her. She started to go into withdrawal, which is very dangerous when you're as weak as she was. And Maylie, her friend, managed to insist that she was given methadone. She began to recover. 10 days later, they cut off her methadone and she died the next day. One of her friends said to the BBC that she looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. And the reason I mention that story in relation to shame and the shame I felt is there's so many things about that story that are so important. The first is that it tells you about the war we're fighting now, right? We're basically still singing Harry Anslinger's song, not Billie's, right? At every stage, when she's put on trial, she said, I just want someone to help me, right? At every stage in that story, think about when she was 11 years old and she was raped, when we could have said that wasn't your fault, you didn't deserve it. When she's 15 years old and the police raid that brothel and she could have been rescued and instead they shame her. At every stage in her addiction, instead of being helped, she's punished and shamed. By the way, you want to think about racism? My God, there are points in this country where every single young person in custody in the Northern Territory is Aboriginal. Every single one, right? You look at the enforcement of the drug laws in this country. If you are a wealthy person in North Sydney, a wealthy white person, you will never be arrested, quite rightly, and that's how it should be. We all know that is not true of people in Indigenous communities or poorer white people,
We've
right?
actually done an episode in conjunction with the SBS and Indigenous deaths in custodies, and it touched all about that.
Yeah, the figures on this are staggering. So partly you can see what we're doing now, but actually, in terms of shame, when it comes to addiction, there's one heroic story we tell in our culture, which is that sometimes people recover from their addiction. And that is indeed a heroic story, and there'll be lots of people listening in that position, and you should be incredibly proud of yourself. That is not the only heroic story about addiction. Billie Holiday never recovered from addiction. She died with her addiction. She was still a fucking hero. No matter what they did to her, she would always find somewhere where she could perform. She would go to the worst parts of the Deep South and she would perform that song. She never let them stop her. And when I think about Billie Holiday now, the person I compare her to in my head, maybe this sounds strange, is, in Tiananmen Square, when there was the huge massacre in 1989, there's a man, we still don't know his name, he's known as Bagman, who seems to have just gone out shopping, was outraged when he came across the tanks rolling over people and stands in front of the tank because he just thinks it's the wrong thing to do for these people to attack these democratic protesters, and the tank rolled over him and killed him, right? To me, Billie Holiday is like that. I never forget when I went to interview Yolanda Bavan, who was herself an amazing jazz singer, is an amazing jazz singer. Billie called her daughter. Yolanda was, I think, 17 when Billie died. And I said to Yolanda, what would you say to Billie Holiday if you could talk to her now? And Yolanda had been telling me how, at the end of her life, Billie thought that they weren't just killing her, they were going to wipe out the memory of her, that no one would remember her. Yolanda said to me, I would say to her, Billie, this morning I went into Whole Foods and they were playing your songs. Nobody forgot you, baby. And, you know, we're never going to forget Billie Holiday's music. Like I said, she was one of the transformative geniuses of the 20th century. But we need to also remember the incredible moral vision of what Billie Holiday stood for. And at some point, we have to start following the vision of Billie Holiday and not the vision of Harry Anslinger. We have to get to that point. For 100 years, we've been singing war songs about people with addiction problems when we should have been singing love songs to them all along.
I think it's also so, like, that story so encapsulates what it is like to love someone, whether it's romantic love or it's, you know, platonic love, whatever that love is. Have someone in your life who you deeply care about and love who is also an addict, and how those things can live side by side.
I think it also highlights the extreme link between addiction and childhood trauma.
Totally. And we've got loads of evidence about that.
What do you think your research on addiction has taught you about willpower?
Whenever I think about willpower, I always think about someone who's based here in Australia who I interviewed. It was the most depressing interview I've ever done in my whole life. He's called Professor Roy Baumeister. He wrote a book called Willpower. You should have him on. It's really interesting.
Imagine being described as that.
I know, and I've done a lot of fucking depressing interviews.
You just said it's the worst interview I've had. You should have him on.
He is a really good and interesting and insightful person, but it was a really sobering moment. So he wrote a book called Willpower. He's done loads of research over 30 years on willpower. He's done a huge amount on this. Really important scientist and thinker. He's based in Queensland. He's at the university there. And I went to interview him when I was starting working on Stolen Focus, my book about why we can't pay attention, how we can get our brains back. I sat down with him and I was like, the exact words are in the book. I'm not going to remember them exactly. But I said to him something like, you know, so I'm writing about why we're struggling to focus and pay attention. Really interested in your research. Love to, you know, what can we learn from you? And all the work you've done on willpower about how we can get our attention back. And he said something like, oh, it's really interesting you asked me that, because I've noticed I can't really pay attention very much anymore. I play Candy Crush a lot on my phone.
We're all the same.
And I was like, it was like, you know, the moment at the end of Invasion of the Body Snatchers when the person realizes everyone's been fucking body snatched. I was like, I wanted to go, but wait a minute, didn't you write a book called Willpower? Aren't you the leading expert on willpower in the whole world?
Yeah,
and you're
what
sitting
hope
there,
do we have?
Exactly. I'm like, you're sitting there telling me you play fucking Candy Crush all day. But I realized, so willpower is real. It's a real thing. The evidence is very clear. We will have all exercised willpower at some point in our lives. Like before I came on here, I nearly had a third cup of coffee, but I thought, no, I'll get too buzzy. I'll get too manic, right? Like
You had it, didn't you? You drank the third cup, didn't
I would have injected it into my veins if I could, I swear. Well, I used to think jet lag was a myth. Now I'm 45 when I land in Australia.
no, it's real.
I'm basically like Joe Biden in that presidential debate. I'm like, what's happening? Why is anyone asking me a question?
Where am I?
So but I exercised my willpower. I only had 2 cups of coffee because that's why I'm talking at this speed and not talking even faster, right? So willpower is real, but willpower is a limited tool, right? The way I think about it, if you go back to the biopsychosocial model, biological causes, psychological causes, social causes, willpower is one little sliver of those psychological causes. So it's real, and we shouldn't use it, and there are things you can do to improve your willpower that I talk about in all my books, and it's really important to not devalue that, but it's also not important to overstate the role that individual willpower can play, because the truth is a lot of us are in environments that are systematically undermining our willpower when it comes to food,
Yeah. And everything's working against you.
drugs, phones, exactly. So it's like running up a down escalator, right? You can do it. I mean, actually, I can't, even on the Ozempic, I can't. But like, you can run up a down escalator, but the worse the environment is, the faster the escalator is pushing you in the other direction, right? So willpower is real, but it's limited.
How much do you think is nature versus nurture when we come to addiction? Because you hear this, like, I think of my mum, for example. She has such an addictive personality. And that's what we say about her all the time. I'm not talking about drugs. I'm just talking about Candy Crush. That's what made me think of her. She does a food that she starts to eat. She does one thing and then she just sticks to it and does it over and over and over and over again. Whereas, like, you know, the rest of the family don't have that addictive personality. How much of that do you think is like biochemical or nature versus nurture?
I would come back to that analogy of the bathtub with 3 taps, like biological tap, psychological tap, social tap. All the evidence is clear that nature and nurture interact, right? So think about, for example, we all know some people who find it really easy to gain weight and some people who just, no matter what they eat, can't gain weight, right? I fucking hate those people, but whatever. So, you know, obviously there is, when it comes to weight, a biological component, but equally that interacts with the environment, right? Obesity has exploded in our lifetimes, right? Like massively blown up. That's not because everyone suddenly lacked willpower. That's because of all sorts of changes in the environment, right? So I would say it's not like there's like some people who've got these biological factors and some people who've got psychological factors and some people who've got social factors. We all have all of them, but some people, one tap is stronger than the other. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It's just one of those things you can't help.
No.
Well, you can.
help. Yeah. You can. So even if you've got, and this actually I think it's really important you just said that, because that's a really natural follow-on thought, which is that, if I've got, one of the problems with telling an overly biological story is it makes people trapped. Or it can make me feel trapped. I'll give you an example. When I was a teenager and I went to my doctor, I was very depressed. I now realise in retrospect, partly because of a lot of childhood trauma and lots of other things.
Of course.
And my doctor, who's a lovely person, told me a really oversimplified story. My doctor said, we know why people get depressed. Some people are just lacking a chemical in their brains. All you need to do is drug yourself, right? So I took some drugs. They made me a little bit better, gave me a lot of side effects. Over time, didn't do that much good for me.
It's a Band-Aid.
Yeah, well, different people. Some people, it massively helps them. Other people, it actually harms them. Anyone listening who's benefiting from chemical antidepressants, my advice is to carry on. But the evidence is clear that it's limited, right, for a lot of people. I don't have an issue with the drugs. My issue, although we should have a balanced conversation about the drugs, but my issue isn't with the drugs. My issue is with the story, that overly biological story that my doctor told me. Because what it does is it produces exactly the result that you naturally had just then, Brittany, that I had. The way I think of it is it does a couple of things. Firstly, if the problem was just in your biology, the first thing it's saying to you is all this pain that you're experiencing doesn't actually mean anything. It's like a glitch in a computer program, right? That your pain is meaningless. It's a malfunction. But the evidence is really clear from people like the World Health Organization. Your pain makes sense. You feel distressful reasons. Your pain is telling you something. And instead of insulting that pain by saying it's purely a biological malfunction or that it's a sign of weakness, which is the other mistaken story we tell or oversimplified story we tell, we say to people, right, we need to listen to this pain, which is very hard to do. You need to do it in a supportive environment. But if we listen to this pain, it can tell us something about what's going wrong, and that can lead us to solutions. But if we're telling this purely biological story, it can exactly do that thing, which is, there's nothing I can do about it then. I'm just fucked. I need just palliative care all my life. But, what it does is it gives you an inaccurate map of your distress.
Or put you in a box where you feel like you can never get out. I was born this way. There's no help for me. This is just what I have to live with the rest of my life, which we know now is completely false.
Well, and it's interesting because a lot of people initially experience that story as giving them relief. Because what we've got in our culture is a sort of, in my view, a false division. Sometimes it's put brain or blame, right? Either you're lazy, you're weak, you brought this on yourself, you're self-indulgent, and that we think about that across the board from
selfish.
addiction. Exactly. Or you've got a brain problem, it's not your fault, you deserve sympathy. And very often when someone like me comes along and says, it's not as simple as the brain story, although there are, of course, biological contributions, what a lot of people hear at first is, oh shit, so you're saying I am weak, it is my fault, I am morally flawed. And you want to go, right, but there's options beyond brain and blame, which are, you didn't design the society in which you live. You're not responsible for the trauma that's inflicted on you as a child. There's all sorts of other factors that go on. But yeah, we're stuck in this very simplistic division, which of course has some truth in it, right? There are real brain elements and individuals do bear some responsibility, but those things happen in much wider contexts that we need to think about and that we can heal together.
Absolutely. Johann, it is honestly such a pleasure to interview you.
Oh.
And I know we've had the privilege of doing so through the screens twice now.
Oh.
But being able to have the conversation with you in real life, in the flesh, and understanding the compassion of which you come to the conversations of addiction with is something that is so compelling. And for anyone who listened to the last episode that we did with Kate, she spoke about addiction from her personal experience as an addict. And it is interesting to hear some of the things that she has said, which are slightly contradicting, but it's contradicting because it's the narrative that she has been told and the narrative that maybe have worked from her own personal experience. So it's really interesting to join the personal experience with the research.
Well, I think it's so interesting. If you think about Fame, for example, I don't know her individual story, though I'm going to go and listen to your episode with her. I know quite a lot of people who've been really famous and addiction problems. For example, having name dropped Oprah, there's nowhere higher to go, but I am friends with Elton John. And although I was once nominated for an award as the worst dressed gay man in Britain, and I was beaten by David, Elton's husband, who I always thought was very well dressed. But
how offensive on so many levels.
But if you think about the way Elton, I'm not giving away anything that he said privately because he talks about this publicly, obviously. Think about him. If you think about what happens to people when they become super famous, their lives become very like that isolated rat cage,
course.
right? Where you've got like nothing but the lever, right? The one lever of drugs. So yeah, you think about that. That's a really good illustration. And it comes back to something you were saying before, Brittany, about it's very easy sometimes when you look at people to go, but you've got everything, right? You've got everything, but you want to look at it as you may have everything by the standards of the culture, but the standards of the culture can be wrong. Think about an example in the history of Australia. You go back to the 1970s in this country, two things happened at the same time, not coincidentally. Domestic violence was completely normalised. The police wouldn't do anything about it. If you were a woman who was being beaten by your husband and you went to the police, they would do nothing. Indeed, they may well side with your husband. At the same time, huge numbers of women were given lots of Valium. And they were told that you've got a nervous disorder. They would go to the house and they go, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'm just anxious all the time. I don't feel right. And they go, oh, there's something wrong with your nerves. You've got a biological problem with your nerves. You need to take Valium, right? If we could go back in time and talk to those women now, we'd go, you don't need Valium. You've got nothing wrong with your nerves. What you need is a domestic violence shelter and a police force that holds men accountable for violence against women, right? But within the standards of the culture, a lot of people couldn't see that. It was taken for granted that patriarchal power over women was okay, right? And then, of course, we had, very conscious I'm a man mansplaining this to both of you and you know it much better than me, but we needed a revolution in women's rights and women's consciousness, which still has a long way to go, but has made enormous progress, right? In the same way, it's like lots of people who will go now, you can well imagine, you know, someone saying to Liam Payne, but you've got everything.
Yeah.
You've won.
Yeah, what's the problem?
Yeah. But of course, you may have won by the standards of the culture, but there's a great line, the Bengali philosopher Krishnamurti said, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society, right? When the culture has gone wrong, there's lots of good things about our culture, obviously, but when the culture has gone wrong, adjusting to the sickness of the culture isn't going to make you well.
It's also why they say money doesn't buy happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, the evidence on this is really interesting, actually. If you're financially insecure, it makes you much less happy. Being poor fucks you, right? It really makes you much less happy. But once you get to, it's about $40,000 in Australian money. Beyond that, you don't become happier with more money, right? So it's actually quite a low level at which, if you're below $40,000, that really will make you miserable, right? Yeah. But above that, there's no extra, what's called hedonic effect. There's no boost in happiness beyond that. Yes, again, it's partly actually the richer you get, the more your values can become corrupted. Think about Donald Trump as a person who thinks life is all about money and status. Yeah. You actually, as you become obsessed with fame and money, you begin to get trained to look for happiness in all the wrong places, actually. It's almost like a kind of KFC for the soul, right? Yeah. You begin to crave things and need things. Elton's talked about this really movingly, how you become obsessed with, you know, stuff that will not make you happy, but you get trapped in that kind of logic and dynamic.
It's because your level of getting the endorphin hit continues to rise with the more that you fill yourself with cars and holidays and super yachts and whatever these people are filling their lives with. That doesn't do it anymore, right? You get to a level where you plateau and you're like, this is my normal, so I need more to get my hit.
I think I would put it slightly differently, although a lot of people would agree with you. Everyone knows that junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick. But there's a lot of evidence that a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. For thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, the kind of values that are bred in us by like Instagram and advertising, everything like that, you're going to feel like shit, right? It's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that's basically what he said. But weirdly,
the Dalai Lama said that one.
Exactly.
Very similar.
But weirdly, nobody had actually scientifically investigated this until this amazing man I got to know named Professor Tim Kasser, who's at Knox College in Illinois. And he discovered basically that the philosophers were right. The more you think life is about money and status, the worse you're going to feel, the less happy you'll be. Junk values teach us to look for happiness in all the wrong places. Absolutely everyone listening knows none of us will lie on our deathbed and think about all the likes we got on Instagram and all the shoes we bought. It's not what makes you feel good in life. You'll think about moments of love and meaning and connection. But as Professor Kasser put it to me, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life. Right? We're bombarded with messaging and machinery designed to get us to crave those likes, to work harder, to buy shit we don't need, to display it on Instagram, to make people go, OMG, so jealous. We've all been there, right?
Yeah, then we go take out our bank loan to pay for it.
Exactly, which makes us feel worse, but we're in this dysfunctional model of values. So yeah, this system of values, we need to break with that. Obviously, I go through in the book how we can do that. I went to places that have begun to do it. I talk about very practical ways we can all do that and things that I've done in my own life to try to break with that, although it's it's difficult, right? We live in this environment that's constantly besieging us. But yes, I think we also need to think of it through that lens.
I can see why we've had you on 3 times, Johann.
Oh.
And to be honest, I don't think this will be the last time. There's so much to talk to you about. To everyone listening, Johann's books you can get literally anywhere. They're bestsellers. You can listen to him on any podcast, but please listen to this one first. Everything's going to be in our show notes. And thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. I meant to say, or Hermione, my publicist is in the next room, will taser me, that we've talked about Chasing the Scream. If you go to chasingthescream.com, you can see where to get the audiobook or ebook, which is about lost connections. It's thelostconnections.com.
Yeah.
Because lostconnections.com turns out to be a band and it took
Oh my
loads of
God,
money.
stop it.
Yeah, so I was like, I didn't know that when I named the book, but it turned out buying that URL would have been like insanely expensive. So it's thelostconnections.com.
We will link the correct one in the show notes.
Thank you so much.